Hi. So I try to keep my channel family friendly. I don't swear, and while I've made a joke or two that might be on the nose, I do think about what I say and how it might come across. Because I know that more than likely, young kids are probably going to stumble across my channel, and I don't want to ruin their lives. Now, as you probably guessed by the title, I'm going to be talking about trigger warnings. But before I start off this video, I want to say that I actually think that trigger warnings can be a good thing. I know a bunch of people who are like, oh, trigger warnings are so dumb, there are no safe spaces in real life, and yada yada yada. And while I don't want to argue too much about this, because that's not the point of this video, I do want to bring up the example of ratings. I think ratings are what trigger warnings should be. You get a general age recommendation, so who they think the target audience is, and then it also gives you like some specifics on why people might want to avoid this, like language or violence, etc. So if you're sensitive to something in particular and you see that on the rating, you know to avoid it. These two games that I played on my channel both had a rating. Not only did these games have ratings, but since they also dealt with some more sensitive content, both of them had sort of trigger warnings at the beginnings of the games where they said, hey, here's some stuff to expect. I think both of them said not to play if you've got anxiety or depression. And everyone seems fine with this. Haven't seen anybody complain about ratings. I'm sure there are people out there who complain about them, but I haven't seen it. And the system also works relatively well. The only time that it failed me was when I took my niece and nephew to see Gremlins, because it's rated PG, and I didn't do my research as to why the PG-13 rating was invented. So, that's my bad. That's my bad. But what about social media? The rating system works really well on stuff like TV shows, video games, and movies, but you can't put a rating on every single post on social media. That's absurd. And I'm not even talking about YouTube videos, because you can also age restrict YouTube videos to 18 or older, so I guess that is sort of like its own trigger warning. I'm talking about social media that you can just like scroll through. Either a picture, a short piece of text, or a short video. You can't regulate that. And personally, I've never really had any problem with social media. Like, obviously, I'd sometimes scroll through stuff and end up seeing stuff that I didn't want to see, but nothing that I like lost sleep over. But sometimes in the comments of the stuff that I didn't want to see, there would be other people who were like, hey, could you have given us a heads up? I've also seen people commenting, asking for a sort of trigger warning on things that I think is kind of ridiculous to ask for a trigger warning for. So I started to think, like, what posts should have trigger warnings? So I made a tier list, because as we all know, the only opinion that matters is mine. Let me quickly go through the criteria that I'm putting for each of these rankings. If something is an S tier, it means that I think that trigger warnings are necessary. If something is an A tier, I think that there should be trigger warnings. If something is in B tier, it's something that I personally would like to have a trigger warning, but like, if you don't, then that's fine. If something is in C tier, I don't think a trigger warning is necessary, but like I sort of see where someone's coming from if they think that it is. If something's in D tier, I think it's kind of ridiculous to ask for a trigger warning. And if something is in E tier, it means that I think that not only should there not be a trigger warning, but I think it is actively rude to ask for one. I'm gonna start with the S and the E tiers because those are much less nuanced in my mind, so I can get through them relatively quickly, so let's start with them. The only real thing that I think should be in the S tier is like flashing lights or any other health risk. While a lot of this video is probably going to be kind of controversial, I don't think it's controversial for me to say that if there's something in a video that can give someone a seizure, maybe give them a heads up about it. And I'm not going to speak too much to this because I don't have epilepsy and I don't want to like give off the impression that I know what I'm talking about, but like, don't give people seizures. Now let's go down to the E tier. Don't put trigger warnings for this stuff, and don't ask for trigger warnings for this stuff. Now I could stay in the E tier for hours, but let me just sum it up to things that people can't control, especially about their body. Don't know what I'm talking about? Cool, let's go through some examples. Any form of tics. If you have Tourette's, you shouldn't be responsible for the comfort of those around you. You can't ask someone to censor themselves when they cannot control it. It's a tic. It is not a voluntary movement. And I don't care what the tic is, if it's a sound or a movement or even an expletive. Like, don't ask people to put a trigger warning for their disability. That's gross in my mind. Self-harm scars, or really any scar at all, but I'm saying self-harm scars in particular because that's the one that people ask for trigger warnings for all the time. Listen, I understand that it's tragic that people self-harm, and I also know that if you have struggled with that in the past, seeing someone with scars like that might upset you. But by telling them that they need to censor themselves or put a trigger warning for their own bodies, you're telling them that their bodies are not appropriate and that they should be ashamed. The last example I'm going to put is this, and it's... Listen. For the sake of my own sanity, I'm choosing to believe that this is either satire or someone just trying to get a rise out of people, but like... I don't know anymore. So like, don't do this. I feel like this is self-explanatory, and if you don't get why this is wrong, then get off my channel. Alright, now that we've covered the extreme ends of the spectrum, let's go to the A tier. I'm also going to make this one really quick, mostly because it's not as funny, and also because I want to get to the stuff that I can make fun of, and it's sort of difficult to make fun of my own opinions. So here's some stuff that I think should be in A tier, meaning that I think it should have a trigger warning. Sexually explicit content, especially if there is violence involved. Serious injury or death. I don't want to see that. I talked about this a bit in my video with Meryl and Phoebe, which feels like it's from forever ago now. But anyways, my opinions are mostly the same, and I get that maybe I'm the weird one for being upset at seeing human beings die. But I don't want to see that. Can you warn me about that? I don't want to see that. Like, that's mostly it. Just stuff that's, like, really... Those are pretty much the two examples I've got. I could probably come up with more if I, like, really thought about it, but those are... yeah. Let's move on to the B tier. So this is stuff that I'd like a trigger warning for, but I don't think that there, like, needs to be one. This is just preference. Surgery videos. Does this one seem oddly specific? That's because it is. A video of a real-life surgery came up on my TikTok For You page while I was just scrolling, and there was no warning for it, and 1 minute I'm like scrolling through people in cosplays and dancing to music, and the next minute I'm seeing someone's belly being sliced open. Like it would have taken... Like, is it crazy for me? Like, you could have just said, hey, I'm about to show you a real surgery. Scroll if you don't... Like... Come on. I mean, part of the reason why this was, like, so shocking is because, like, this is TikTok. A bunch of kids use this app. And, like, I'm not gonna get super in-depth into this video, but, like, if you have a platform that is mostly used by children, maybe that factors into how regulated the content should be. Horror content. So I don't mind this at all, and, like, personally, I actually really like seeing horror stuff, because that interests me. But, like, I can understand why, if you do not like horror, you would not want to see a jump scare while scrolling through your timeline. And finally, this one is also just for me, videos of people in serious distress. Again, this is probably something that doesn't actually need a trigger warning and is just, like, my own thing, but I don't like seeing videos of people who are super upset. And I don't know why they're posted at all, and I don't want to see them. I don't know, like, it's so uncomfortable. Like, am I crazy? Comment below if I've lost my mind. But, like, I am genuinely uncomfortable seeing videos where people are uber distressed. Like, especially young kids. Like, young kids who are, like, really upset about something. Like, something serious, like a death. Like, I can't. It's, like, I cannot deal with it. Also, sort of related, but if your kid is having a meltdown, don't post it to social media. Like, not, like, put a trigger warning. Don't post your kid's meltdowns on your social media. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Alright, moving on to the C tier. This is stuff that I don't think needs trigger warnings, but I can sort of see why people would. Weapons. Weapons are inherently violent, and so I sort of get it, but also, come on. Especially if and I'm talking about weapons that aren't being used in, like, violent situations. I've seen people want, like, either trigger warnings or complete censor of weapons just there. And one video I saw, sort of harkening back to the self-harm thing from earlier, was a video also on TikTok where somebody was using a razor blade to cut an X onto the top of like bread dough so that it would have like a little X on the top of it when it came out of the oven. And everybody in the comments was like, hey, please put a trigger warning for the razor. Like, guys, I understand that razors can be upsetting, but it was on bread. And as for weapons that are just like swords or guns or, I don't know, bows and arrows, mostly knives I've seen trigger warnings for, but I'm sure that people want trigger warnings for any kind of weapon. If they're not being used and there's no, like, blood on them, I think it's fine. Cartoon violence, meh, like, it's not the same. I'm gonna just go ahead and say a very controversial statement. Cartoon violence is not as bad as real life violence. There you go. There's my statement of the year. Curse words. I get it, and I don't agree at all, but it is in the C tier because, like, I don't understand it, but I get it. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's the best explanation I can come up with. Alright, finally, the D tier. This one's probably the longest, but for both of our sakes, let me just condense it into specific phobias. Listen, I have a phobia disorder. Now, I don't feel comfortable sharing exactly what the phobia is, but for this example, I'm gonna say chairs. Let me tell you a little bit about my chair phobia. Most people don't have, like, a super intense phobia of chairs, so chairs would often appear in, like, day-to-day life or on social media without trigger warnings. However, the problem is that I had a very intense phobia of chairs, so every time I saw them, I would go into a severe panic attack. Now, obviously, this was not a good way to live. Now, at this point, I had 3 options. The first option was to lock myself in my room and delete any social media to avoid ever running across a chair again. The second option was to demand that trigger warnings be put for every chair in real life and on the internet so that I would never have to see it again, but while also retaining my freedom to, like, live a normal life. Or 3, I could nip it in the bud and deal with my situation so that I stopped having panic attacks every time I saw a chair. So I did exposure therapy, which, if you're wondering, sucks. Exposure therapy sucks, and I hated it. And despite how much I did not like exposure therapy, it helped. I'm not cured of my phobia. However, I've gotten to a point where I can see chairs, hear about them, even, like, talk about them without going into a panic attack. And even now, when I scroll social media, a chair will often come up, and I will get really uncomfortable and scroll away really quickly. But I just take a couple deep breaths, and I'm like, okay, didn't like that, and I keep going. And I was able to do that because I went to therapy for it. And is my phobia cured? Well, I don't know, you tell me. Instead of actually telling you what the phobia is, I'm using chairs as a stand-in. Does that sound like my phobia is cured? So yeah, no, I still struggle with it, like a lot. The problem with phobias is that they can be literally anything. While your phobia is valid, I would never clown on someone for having a phobia. Like I said, I have a phobia, that would be hypocritical. I will say that you can't ask people to censor your specific phobia, because then we'd have to censor literally everything, because there is someone out there who is afraid of everything. Now, before you go into the comments and tell me, Chloe, nobody asks for censors for their specific phobias. Yes, they do. For example, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people ask for trigger warnings for razor blades, even though razor blades are like a tool, and even when they're being used for something like baking bread. Do you see where I'm going with this? I put that one in the C tier because it's a very common one, so I guess, like, there's something to be said for, like, if 90% of the population is afraid of something, then it's more reasonable to expect a trigger warning than if only, like, 1% is. But, like, it's still the same idea, right? It is a specific trigger that you have that you're asking people to accommodate. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Here are a couple things that I have seen people demand trigger warnings for. Pointing at the camera, yelling, creepy music, general uneasiness. I don't even know what that means. Well, anyways, now you've got your ranking, but as you've already probably gotten, it's a little bit more complicated than this, and I want to get into that. I've stated my opinions on what should or shouldn't have trigger warnings, but, like, this is my opinion. I made the joke at the beginning of the video that the only opinion that matters is mine, but, like, let's be real here. I don't know what I'm talking about 90% of the time. The problem is that there are so many different triggers out there, and if you know that you have something that's really triggering to you, maybe you should try to take your own precautions instead of relying on trigger warnings to do the work for you. I once saw a video that critiqued other videos that started to just say trigger warning without giving any context as to what the trigger was for, by saying it's like food saying allergen without saying what the allergen is. And, like, while I sort of get it, let me use your analogy for you. Let's say you are deadly allergic to something. It doesn't matter what it is, but something you eat. You're deadly allergic to some ingredient, and you get a food and it has an allergen warning on it, but it doesn't say what the allergen is. Maybe you should just not eat it, because maybe the allergen has got nothing to do with what you're allergic to, but maybe it does. Better safe than sorry. Because the allergen warning actually does do something, because it eliminates anyone who has severe allergens. If you aren't allergic to anything, you're not gonna mind eating a food that's got an allergen warning, because you've got nothing to worry about. So while I get that general trigger warnings can seem unhelpful, they're actually warning anyone who has severe triggers. Also, it's weird to me to compare, like, deadly food allergies to triggers, because as someone who's had panic attacks, like, they suck. I'm not gonna sit here and say panic attacks are great, but, like, dying is worse. And finally, before I wrap up this video, I want to say that if you have anything that, like, really triggers you, or if you have any severe phobias, I want you to know that you're not alone. I know what it's like to have something that is constantly worrying you, that you're constantly on the lookout for, that you do everything in your power to avoid, because even thinking about it just gives you the heebie-jeebies. Like, you just can't stand it. I know what that's like. But expecting social media to protect you from that stuff is unrealistic. The best thing to do in your situation is to seek help, maybe therapy or anxiety medication, to see if you can deal with this and live a normal life without constantly worrying about running into whatever it is that scares you. It might also be worth it to consider maybe taking a break from social media until you can handle your triggers more effectively, because the problem with social media is that it's mostly unregulated. So if you're really terrified about running into something, maybe you just should avoid the platform altogether. But, like, what do I know? I'm an 18-year-old that's speaking exclusively from experience. I don't know what I'm talking about. Talk to your doctor. That's the message of this video. Anyways, tell me in the comments, what do you think of my tier list? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Let's have a conversation about this. Respectfully, please. If I get yelled at in the comments, I swear to God, I'm gonna... Well, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but you're not gonna like it. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.